Welcome, everyone. This is Stassi with the Vesper Meadow Education Program, and I'm going to be going over half of the slide presentation for Lesson 6, Leading the Way with TEK. This is from our Fire Ecology and the Human Relationship curriculum, which was created in partnership with the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. TEK is short for Traditional Ecological Knowledge, and TEK is practices and worldviews that were developed by Native peoples across what is now known as America over thousands and thousands of years. TEK knowledge, practices, and understandings were passed down from generation to generation and continue into today and the present day. Let's get started. So one of the first things we'll go over is the long Indigenous existence. As you can see here, it's a period of 10,000 years or more that extends all the way into the present. The long Indigenous existence is a term adapted from a book by Charles Wilkinson entitled The People Are Dancing Again, The History of the Siletz Tribe of Western Oregon. Another term that you might hear in reference to the long Indigenous existence or the period of time that Native people have existed in place or on land, their land bases, is a term called time immemorial, and also refers to a period of thousands and thousands of years, or also sometimes said as a period before memory. So this is a map of what's now known as Oregon. As you can see here, there were numerous tribes or nations all over what is now known as Oregon. And all of these tribes and nations spoke many different languages, which is also reflected here in this map. At various points within our nation's history now, as settlers moved from the East Coast to the West Coast, a lot of Native people were removed from their homelands to various reservations. A good practice is to know whose ancestral lands are we on right now. And there's a good website, native-land.ca, where you can enter in your zip code and learn about whose native lands you are on. To explain a little bit more about traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, it is very intimate knowledge about their environments, including plants, animals, water, and climate. As Native people over these thousands of years didn't have grocery stores or lumber stores or any of the conveniences that we have today, they still needed to obtain food, shelter, clothing from the environment around them. And so over thousands of years, they developed very ingenious ways of doing so. And that knowledge was passed down, as mentioned, from generation to generation. This woman here has a basket cap in her hand. It has a design from her people and her culture. And around her neck is what's called dentilium. It's a shell. And around her waist is a skirt of shells. Not quite sure what the material is woven from, but all of these materials were gathered from her homelands. Traditional ecological knowledge continues today. Shown here is a method of cooking fish over open fire, sometimes referred to as pit cooking. And this has been a practice, again, that has been going on for thousands and thousands of years. Some good vocabulary to go over and some new terms to learn. Kin-centric. Kin is another term for family. And so one aspect of what's called Indigenous worldview, or how Native people viewed and lived within the world around them, was by seeing everything as kin, or family or relative. So that would mean that Native people used to and continue to see land as relative, water as relative, trees, plants, animals as relative. There are a lot of good discussion questions on these slides, so teachers, please feel free to pause and have class discussions. A good question is, how would our world be different if we viewed land, trees, plants, animals as relatives? Another important term is renewal capacity. As you can imagine, again, without grocery stores and such, Native people had to understand how to create abundance where they were living for food, clothing, and shelter. So renewal capacity refers to the ability of a species to renew themselves, and Native people supported that renewal capacity of key species, plants, etc., that were utilized. This has a what's called reciprocal or mutual benefit. So as Native people create abundance for salmon or trees or plants that are used for basketry, those relatives, as we shall say, are in abundance as well. And then there's a lot for everyone, humans and non-human relatives. Seasonality is another good term. Food and plant materials change with the seasons. Grasses bloom and then die by the fall. Food crops such as camas lily or bulbs grow out at only certain times of the year. So Native people would often move with some of their key foods, such as elk or camas or acorns. So they would be moving around with the seasons in relation to the particular type of food crop that they were gathering and tending. Use of fire was very important as a land tending tool, and we'll talk about that more in a couple slides. Water and fire and other elements were often seen as sacred. As mentioned, they could be seen as relatives and treated with the same respect and care that you would as a human relative. So we're going to go over a few of the TEK practices that can have and continue to tend what is now known as Oregon by Native people. These are practices and terms that you may already be familiar with, and we'll be sharing about them in relation to Indigenous knowledge. Fire is a very useful tool for land tending and ecological abundance. Fire recycles nutrients from old growth into the soil. It keeps areas clear for grazing animals or for certain species of plants. And it burns off old or weak or dead plants and again, returning those nutrients to the soil. And fire can also help control pests, such as worms that infest acorns. Pruning was and continues to be a practice for plants such as this hazel bush. As you can see in the background and in the foreground, a lot of these shoots are very straight. Both cultural fire and pruning practices help these shoots to grow very straight after they have been pruned. And straight branches without a lot of side shoots are very beneficial and useful for baskets. Weeding was another common practice that could be done by fire as well. And so weeding is a practice of removing plants that aren't being utilized to make space for the more valuable plants that are being utilized for food, cordage, etc. Tilling was a very common land use, land tending practice. Shown here is a traditional digging stick. A lot of digging sticks were made out of very strong wood, such as yew, and the tips were burnt with fire to harden them further, as you can see in this photo. In the bottom of the picture there, the tip of this digging stick has been burnt, and the handle is made from bone antler. Tilling is very beneficial for the soil. It helps to introduce oxygen into the soil, and utilizing digging sticks can help gather, divide, or replant root foods such as clamacilli bulbs or yampa. Spreading seeds was a common practice to either increase the density of food crops in a certain area or to carry seeds to spread into other locations as they were moving from place to place through season to season. Transplanting was another common practice. Shown on the left are clamacilli bulbs, and on the right is a photo of clamacilli in flower. And so transplanting would have entailed digging with a digging stick, pulling up the bulbs, and either increasing the density in this meadow or carrying it to another location. Irrigation was also a common practice and could be done by digging small channels to divert water from one place to another. The flower here, Brodia, is a water-loving plant, and so would need potentially some irrigation if you wanted to increase the density of Brodia in this area. Another good term to learn about is what's called a keystone species. Salmon is a keystone species for an ecosystem. And the term keystone species implies that this salmon, for example, as the keystone species here, are a very key to making a place abundant. I've heard and read from Native people and from scientific sources that we essentially wouldn't have the redwoods on the Pacific Northwest coast that we have without salmon. Salmon, as their bodies die and decompose into the soil, are very nutrient dense and beneficial. So as bears eat salmon, other predators or predatory birds, such as eagles or hawks, catch and consume salmon, their flesh and bones would decompose and a lot of nutrients for the soil wherever those bears and other hunting species are carrying the salmon that they catch and eat. So for another example of why a keystone species is important, if waters and rivers are polluted, the numbers of salmon go down, which means there's not as much nutrients for that ecosystem to be abundant. Speaking of abundance, as you can see here, if you remember, this is camas lily in bloom. And as you can see in this photo, it's almost like a sea of camas. This is a very abundant example of camas lily in a meadow. So this is kind of grocery store before there was grocery stores. You are creating your own abundance, your own places to store food naturally. Another good term is legacy trees. Legacy trees are very old trees that have been around for either hundreds or thousands of years. Legacy trees are very resilient to fire, such as a small grass fire under the canopy of this oak tree. And again, fire can be very beneficial to this tree. So as those dead leaves might be burned off, or as cultural burns were done to kill off weevils or other insects, that would increase the abundance of what this acorn tree was providing. So this concludes the first half of the presentation slides for lesson 6. This is a good time to get up, stretch, take a break. Maybe afterwards, your teacher might lead you in the second series of slides. There's also a fun land stewardship worksheet where you can enact these concepts and imagine how you would tend the land for abundance. For teachers, there's some good additional resources on page 158. There are resources for Indigenous fire stewardship, do's and don'ts of teaching about traditional ecological knowledge, and tips for teaching about Native peoples. Please visit the Vesper Meadow website. We also have a blog, and please enjoy some of the other videos that we have on our YouTube channel. Thank you for listening, and thank you for learning.